And so my little commentary here is like, teach your kids what things are before they're having to like defend them. Teach your kids what marriage is and what life is and what human rights are and what their faith is, so that when they're challenged, they have a response.
And I think that's why you see a lot of our generation that can't articulate why you can care for, be friends with, love people who identify as homosexual and still say same-sex marriage legalized for the country is not good. It is not a good thing.
Hi, welcome to Wild and Beautiful. We're Joanna Hyatt and Lauren Enriquez, your co-hosts who every week are helping you live out your faith in a way that's biblically rooted but culturally relevant.
Hey, so I got a fun text this week from someone I haven't talked to in like 10 years. Most of my life is people I haven't talked to in 10 years because I left Los Angeles almost a decade ago.
Oh, that's why you're always hearing from these people crawling out of the woodwork. I'm like, she lives in like a small town, it seems like. How is she always hearing from people that she never sees?
Well, because all of us fled Los Angeles like rats bailing a sinking ship in different phases.
Okay.
But it's funny to see how many have left. There's like nobody left there, just like 3 people I know. And so every once in a while, I think they stumble across, I don't know what I'm doing. You always wonder, you're like, did you just get curious and look me up? Anyway.
Yeah.
So I got this message and they had started listening to my podcast for the first time.
Amazing.
And my favorite part was, I said, well, thanks so much. And shared it with their kids who are in their 20s. I said, that's awesome. She goes, yeah.
Happy to have you.
It's my go-to treadmill podcast. And I kind of cheered by myself. I was like, what? We are someone's go-to treadmill podcast.
Anyone else?
So that begs the question to all of you listening. Where do you listen to us? When do you listen to us? Are we like your drive to school podcast? Probably not after you've picked up the kids podcast. Are we your workout at the gym after finals podcast? Are we your stuck in traffic podcast, doing the dishes podcast? Like, when do you listen to us? Because that actually is very interesting. You can email us at wildandbeautifulpodcast@gmail.com. But also, you can just share in the reviews. Make sure to rate us because that helps. And we do read those. We read all of them. We read them and weep. No, only one has been mean. The rest have been great. Yeah. So anyway, I found that encouraging and fun, and it made me curious where everybody else is listening to us.
I can't do podcasts on the treadmill. I need something to a little pump me up. So I'm actually like, that's such a huge compliment that we
I need something that will help me forget I'm on the treadmill. That's really what I'm looking for.
If we're doing that for someone, then go us.
Anyway, it was super encouraging. To Dawn, I appreciate you. Thank you for that highlight this week. And then also, I had this happen this weekend, and I thought of you because I feel like you would never do this. But do you ever say things and you don't think anything of it, and then after the fact, you're like, oh, there was a way I could have said that was less awkward?
Oh, all the time.
Because you're like a media communication. So I feel like you are pretty honed to say what is appropriate in every context. Is that not true?
But I'm a media and communications person in the most controversial human rights field that exists. Right. So I'm used to talking to reporters about why dismembering babies is wrong. Translate that into talking to a person at the gym, not necessarily my skill set. So no, I definitely lay awake at night,
must have a lot of
asleep,
friends.
and get jolted. My friends are very good friends because they accept me for who I am. Yes, you are.
Well, this was not to a friend. This was to a practically stranger. I was at my daughter's performance of the Nutcracker, picking her up, and see how I subtly bragged on my kid? Okay.
Oh, yeah. It was cute. I saw photos.
They'll probably be in our Christmas card. But so this woman who is in my bark method class came up and, somehow, of course, in my small town, we're like 6 degrees of separation. She goes, oh, where have you been? We've missed you. Without thinking, I just blurted out. I said, oh, well, I had acute urinary retention and I had to get a catheter. And so my husband wanted me to just take it easy for a week or 2. And she just kind of blinks and she goes, you were catheterized? I'm like, is that the word? That sounds like I was put under. I said, yeah, but it's fine. It was only 24 hours. We're good. We're all good. Later, like 15 minutes later, I realized I didn't have to say that. I could have just said, oh, I've had some health issues. Oh, I've been under the weather.
No,
I've been sick.
No, okay. I disagree. Okay, I disagree. Here's my thing. I think people the people I want to hang out with are the people that want to know the details.
That tell you that they've had a catheter.
Yes, I want to know the details. If someone said to me, I had some health issues, I'd be like, and what were they? And can I see photos? Like I'm the person that people text me their photo of like the thyroid that got removed or like the surgery scar, because I like that stuff. And we can be acquaintances if you don't want to know about those things and you don't want me to know about those details. But like friends, they want to know.
Okay, people, if you email one of those photos in, please address for Lauren, because I do not like blood. I do not like seeing scars surgeries and stitches.
And dissecting things.
Nope. No, thank you. Nope. Pass. Hard pass. This should give you all a lot of hope in today's conversation of awkward things that are going to be said and later could probably be phrased better. And it's potential that this conversation today is basically harpooning any of our future political careers. But that's the point of being wild and beautiful. Say the things that you should say without having to overthink whether or not they should be said in this time. Because honestly, the truth needs to be spoken. Which, if you've been following the news, maybe you've guessed, we're talking about the Marriage Act that just passed.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it'll potentially get you the Disrespect Marriage Act.
Disrespect for marriage. Because they're calling this BS the Respect for Marriage Act. No, that's not what it is. But anyways, we'll get into that later.
So here's how it's going to go today, friends. We're going to talk about what it is. And maybe you've heard, and we have a different take on it. Like, stick around to the end because you get to hear our slightly conspiracy theories. Maybe not.
Because we're not politicos. We're like Christian moms that follow the politics a little bit.
Who are also trying to look at the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. So stick with us for the bigger picture of what we think this means. Why there's actually a silver lining out of this. And my biblical over-spiritualization of the whole situation, because that's what we do as evangelicals.
We're here for it. We are here for it. Yeah. Okay. So I haven't really been following the Marriage Act, the Disrespect for Marriage Act, since, it was introduced, and I kind of followed it as it was like passing through the first chamber. I know there were some amendments raised, but I really don't know the whole story. So can you just give us like the Spark Notes version of what
I'll do my best, because honestly, all I have is the Spark Notes version in front of me.
Okay,
so
good.
It's called HR 8404 because y'all are nerds, and it repealed the Defense of Marriage Act. Now, the Defense of Marriage Act was actually a bipartisan measure. So that means both Democrats and Republicans voted for this. And it was signed in 1996 by that shining light of a faithful, good marriage, President Bill Clinton.
So good.
So he signed this measure.
Which just goes to show that God can use broken instruments.
It's ironic. And the Defense of Marriage Act defined marriage as the union of one man and one woman. So by this Disrespect Marriage Act passing, it repealed that. It essentially stripped, I heard one commentator said, it removed the definition of marriage as one man, one woman from federal law.
Wow. Okay. I thought that it was basically like, you know how Congress wants to codify Roe v. Wade all the time?
Yep.
I thought they were like codifying Obergefell, the decision that legalized gay marriage. I did not realize that this repealed DOMA.
That was an offhanded comment on World Magazine's The World and everything in it. So that was, that caught me because I thought, well, that has huge ramifications. Not only have you codified same-sex marriage into federal law, you have essentially removed the definition of what marriage was for thousands and thousands of years through all of history in all civilizations. One man, one woman. Yes, there are polygamous situations and societies and cultures, but the societies that have grown and thrived, encouraged and supported marriage between one man and one woman. It does not work well to have any other model.
It's not a Christian institution either. Like marriage is a human institution. The union of a man and a woman to create a family is a human institution that's been around before Jesus wasn't instituted. The sacrament was instituted by Jesus. But yeah, I think that's something that we have to keep in mind when we talk about marriage, is that this is trying to redefine this, isn't just trying to change a Christian norm. It's trying to change like reality that's existed from basically the beginning of humanity.
And instinctively, I think people have understood this is, you just saw, like, this is the best way to form units Mm-hmm. I can take care of this unit of people. Kids are protected, safe. Mm-hmm. A father is more likely to care for the children that he has, well, this is an old-fashioned word, sired.
Fathered.
Right. That works too. They just, and so there's reasons to it. And we could go into a whole thing of different periods of history and looking at that. And that would be fascinating. Someone do a study on that. Mm-hmm. But this repealed the defense of marriage, it defined marriage as one man and one woman. And, it's been interesting because, someone like Andrew Sullivan, he is center left. He identifies as a gay man, and he saw this thing. And in general, I have found him pretty measured. He is not far extremist. He thinks the transgender push is too much. It's out of control. Mm-hmm. But he saw this as like a measured, moderate response. It was really interesting to read his breakdown of like, yeah, this is good. This is two sides coming to a middle point. No extreme. It's not changing anything. It's not adding anything, which we'll get into this later, begs the question, if it's not changing anything, why did you need it? But
yeah, it also, you said two sides coming together. That is basically what happened in terms of Democrats and Republicans uniting to pass this measure. So that's something to keep in mind. Like when you go to the polls next time, is elect people that share your values, because a lot of people, even who identify as Republican right now, are siding with something that would have not even a Democrat or a Republican would have voted for 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, and what's especially, I think, slimy about this one is it passed during a lame duck Congress, which means, for those of you that don't know, it means after an election happens. So there are people who are voting on this who have already lost their seat, who have already chosen not to run again. Mm-hmm. So they're going to experience zero political consequence, zero career consequence. And we saw that in, I think, 3 or 4 of the senators who are Republicans who crossed the aisle to vote for this. They're not running for re-election. So they basically can be like, screw you voters, I'm on my way out. And you have no way to hold me accountable for what I just did. And most likely, because they were voted in places like Missouri, like most likely they were voted in with the expectation that they would hold the line on this. So to me, that seems just shady, the real Slim Shady. So you've got the middle to left saying this is great. It just protects. But then what a lot of people on the middle to right were saying is that this actually still endangers faith-based organizations. So the middle to left is saying this does nothing to affect faith-based organizations. You can still practice your religious, affiliations and beliefs, which, if history has told us anything in this country in the last 15 years, no.
You got to read between the lines on that claim, though, because they're defining what affecting faith-based organizations means very narrowly.
Yeah.
So I think what the bill says is that basically churches can't be forced to perform same-sex marriages or officiate them or whatever. But the bill does not protect believers from being forced to engage in providing services, for example, that might violate their consciences. From what I remember, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I heard this a while back when the bill was first introduced, so maybe this was changed, but that was my understanding of how they were getting away with this narrative that it doesn't force faith-based organizations.
No, it endangers them because it threatens litigation. What I read is it threatens litigation and liability for faith-based social service organizations who follow their views when working with the government. Because think about it. If you have just stripped the definition of marriage, but you have codified it to be same-sex marriage, and we know this, in Texas, there is, I think, a Catholic foster adoption agency currently fighting the state because they don't want to place kids with same-sex couples. Right. And they're being pushed. We saw that happen in Pennsylvania. Finally, that Catholic adoption agency was given permission to practice their faith in their organization.
Permission. But I hate that phrase, given permission to practice their faith.
I know. That's why I say
they had their right to practice their faith acknowledged. Yeah.
And so I don't believe it for a second, when I'm told, hey, nothing's going to change. Like, is this coming from the same people that told us, as long as you just acknowledge same-sex marriage, like Obergefell did, the Supreme Court decision, we just want to be left alone. No, we have seen it is not about being left alone. It is now about you either accept us or we destroy you. You applaud us or we destroy you. We saw that with Candace Cameron a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that's true.
And they just come after her. Why? Because she disagrees with them. And
she didn't say anything derogatory.
She did not.
And let's just put out the disclaimer right now. Joe and I have gay friends. We love people who are in homosexual relationships. This is not about quote unquote homophobia, which I think it's questionable whether that's even a thing. This is about redefining reality and how that's going to affect our culture and possibly endanger our practice of our faith, which is protected in the Constitution. That's what we're talking about now. It's not an indictment of individuals who choose to live this lifestyle. And that's exactly what Candace Cameron, she made a comment simply, I believe, just respecting, celebrating traditional marriage, traditional values, qualifier marriage. Yeah. She was celebrating marriage. And this was construed as homophobic and hateful and just, it's unbelievable. Like you said, it's not an exaggeration to say that there are people who want to destroy anybody who does not celebrate same-sex marriage.
And we know that, again, this is not representative of everybody, but as is often the case, you have a small extreme that becomes the loudest voice.
Yes.
I know a lot of people who would say, just leave us be. We don't care what you do, and we don't like. So this is not to say that everybody in the LGBTQ community is on a warpath.
No.
In fact, most of them are not.
A lot of them, including Christian members of that community, who are very uncomfortable with this ideology being forced down the throats of people who just want to coexist in peace and don't want to be forced to acknowledge something that they don't believe in, or possibly lose their job, lose their livelihood, lose their reputation.
And even many of them are raising the flag on where this is going. As we've talked about before, I think it's Gays Against Grooming is an Instagram handle that tries to highlight what is happening to kids. Yeah. And so we've said it before, there's going to be unlikely allies in the days ahead. But okay, so backing up quickly, how do we get to this point where marriage, the traditional definition for thousands of years, has been kicked to the curb? We've codified same-sex marriage as the definition. Talk about Obergefell.
Okay. Well, there's been an offense and a defense, or a lack of defense, if you want to put it that way. The offense is, like you said, a small cohort of people, kind of ideologues who have been kind of, I don't know, scheming seems like a kind of conspiracy word, but there's a small cohort of ideologues who had a vision in their mind of what could be if marriage were redefined by the government. And they very aggressively pushed that forward in a very similar way to how we got Roe v. Wade legalizing abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy in all 50 states in the United States, striking down all the pro-life laws that existed before. A similar approach was taken to marriage. We saw in 2011, I believe, the Supreme Court handed down a decision called Obergefell versus Hodges. I think that's the full name of the case. And in that decision, I believe it was, I should have done a little bit more of a refresh before this, but I believe it was Justice Kennedy who wrote the majority opinion in Obergefell. And Obergefell codified basically a quote unquote right to same-sex marriage, and basically said that every state needs to recognize same-sex marriages in the U.S. Something that was interesting and that has been the automatic kind of response of a lot of Christians and people who acknowledge marriage as the union of one man and one woman is, why did Obergefell only acknowledge the right of a same-sex couple, one man and one man, or one woman and one woman?
That doesn't seem very inclusive.
Right, because Obergefell, the decision and some of the decisions that preceded it, it seems like they took pains to express that what constitutes marriage is when two people have affection for each other, and they should be able to have that recognized legally, which is such a vague definition. It really doesn't explain why polygamy or polyamory would be excluded from that definition. And we're supposed to save our conspiracy theories for the end, but I'm not going to because I'm going to forget to mention this. Recently in New York, in New York, a judge, I believe it was in New York, a judge actually legally recognized a throuple. I resent the fact that I even know what the word throuple means, and I blame it on Obergefell. But a throuple is when three people are in a relationship together, and there was some like obscure real estate renters' rights case that came before a New York judge, and she legally recognized this throuple as a legally protected relationship in New York. So people say the slippery slope argument is a fallacy. It's absolutely not a fallacy. Slippery slopes are 100% real, and I wish that claim that it's a fallacy would die because it's not a fallacy. It's real. But yeah, you can see from Obergefell, the slippery slope very clearly. I mean, leaving aside whether like Drag Queen Story Hour is a descendant of like this worldview, even, you at least you can say like, okay, now in New York, we know that without Obergefell, throuples would not be legally recognized by a judge, but they are. And so the question is, that's the offense. And I just quickly want to mention the defense, where the defense failed is that none of us were catechized or just taught it, whether we're religious or not, what marriage was in the first place. So it wasn't until this attempt to redefine what it is happened that anyone was like, oh, shoot, now we need to go figure out what it is because this doesn't sound right. And we were like way too late to the game. And so my little commentary here is like, teach your kids what things are before they're having to like defend them. Teach your kids what marriage is and what life is and what human rights are and what their faith is so that when they're challenged, they have a response.
And I think that's why you see a lot of our generation that can't articulate why you can care for, be friends with, love people who identify as homosexual and still say same-sex marriage legalized for the country is not good. It's not a good thing. Mm-hmm. And so there's this, it just feels like a constant caving of our generation. And I think in large part because we grew up in homes in a time where it was like, everything was kind of like had an underlying Christianity to it. You kind of just knew what these values were. We were living in a post-Christian world, but we hadn't slammed into it. Mm-hmm. And so nobody, I don't think, was really looking ahead to say, are we raising our kids to engage essentially as rebels in this culture? We're like, no, like go see you at the pole. Pull the Bible study. And we slammed into it and people didn't know how to articulate, which is why I love organizations like Summit Ministries out of Manitou Springs, Colorado Springs, because they are constantly training up young people, high school, college age, in these issues as in apologetics. Good. Send your kids, save it for when you have kids. It was so good, and it was required for each of us in my family before we went to college. And they go after all of these issues, and you don't get to defend your position from a biblical standpoint. Because and the guy distinctly remember the conversation. The guy was like, yeah, but what if I don't believe in the Bible? He obviously did. He's like, but what if I don't believe in the Bible? So you're just throwing out a book at me and I'm going to throw out a book at you. And you realize you're right. And I talked about this with Clavin on our episode.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. Yes. I've listened to that episode like 3 times because it's my favorite and I love him. And it was so good.
I was not needed. He is brilliant and just so great. Oh my gosh,
but you did great.
And it's this idea though of like, we're living in a time where, and it always has been, I love that point from his book, Truth and Beauty. It's actually a battle between belief and unbelief. Mm-hmm. And so things like Obergefell and the Disrespect of Marriage Act, and even the Balenciaga issue, which is kind of from this.
If you haven't followed
the Balenciaga issue, go check out our friend Allison Senefante's stories because she did a ton on it. They deleted
their whole Instagram over this, so
it was real bad. But Patrina Mosley, who has also been on our podcast, Patrina, I always get that wrong. I'm so sorry, Patrina. She was on back in January of 2022. Go check that out. Maybe February. Yes. She pointed out that Obergefell is one of many in a long line, Balenciaga being the most recent, to desensitize us, to really wear down these distinctions of what is right and what is wrong. Anything more you want to put on that one? Because you know her. Well, and you're smart.
Yeah. Oh, she's so great. Guys, also, if you don't follow Patrina Mosley, go follow her. She has a newsletter, an email newsletter, and it is like chock full of all the talking points that you need for the the Thanksgiving dinner. Just kidding.
We'll also link to this
so
clip
good. We'll
link.
We'll link to her episode too. Patrina, sorry, let me start that again, Kyle. This goes back to the weak defense issue that we were talking about. I think that when we don't have a reason to defend a status quo that's good, we have no issue with the status quo being changed. Now, what I think is also notable about that, and so in the case of marriage and Obergefell, we didn't really understand what marriage was or care about it enough to defend it, and Christians were getting divorced out the wazoo. And so marriage had kind of been belittled a bit and not understood. And so when the status quo was changed by the Supreme Court and they were just like, oh, hey guys, we're just going to change the definition of marriage. Maybe it didn't sit well with people, but they didn't have the foundation to defend why the status quo couldn't be changed. Okay, that's true. But also when we change the status quo back, people may also not be that mad about it. And I was talking to Joe about this earlier today, but I think there might be kind of a case study in Texas where prior to Roe v. Wade being reversed, Texas passed the most stringent pro-life law in the country, the Heartbeat Act, and it protected children at the moment that their heartbeat could be detected. Incredibly, and thanks be to God, today there's like 13 or 14 states where abortion is basically outlawed, but that was inconceivable just a year and a half ago when Texas found this incredible legal way to pass a heartbeat law that would be upheld by the courts and couldn't be just sued out of existence by Planned Parenthood through civil enforcement. And what was interesting about that, now that we're a year and a half out from that, less than a year and a half, just over a year out from that happening, we have a little bit of a retrospective back on that case. And what we saw is abortions plummeted in this state. Yes, of course, some women probably went out of state to procure abortions, knowing they couldn't get them in Texas. But if you look at the pro-life networks here in Texas, what they saw, these networks that actually help women who are actively seeking an abortion when they interact with these organizations, their calls didn't necessarily skyrocket. And the women they did talk to, a lot of them felt relieved. We talked to Chelsey Youman about this when she came on our show. A lot of women who called Human Coalition were expressing feelings of relief that they didn't feel pressured or forced to undergo an abortion. Anyway, this is a long kind of sidebar just to say that the status quo was reversed in Texas. The sky didn't fall. Everybody was fine. And so, yes, we might be looking the other way and be distracted when the status quo is changed in a bad way, but we should still press on to bring it back to what is good and what is true and what is right, because there's a good chance that people will be accepting of that as well.
And here's my first conspiracy theory as it relates to
Bring
that.
it.
Here we go, friends. Because, okay, so I pray this often. My husband knows this. I pray that the devil will overplay his hand.
Mm-hmm.
Because think about it. He's arrogant. He's prideful. He thinks he knows. Great example of where the enemy overplayed their hand was in the Dobbs case. Because when that went to the Supreme Court, it was the pro-abortion side that put the line in the sand and said, you have to decide whether the legal precedent of Roe versus Wade is sufficient. So they actually put the burden all the way there. They didn't just say, can we just battle out whether we can do 15 weeks? They were the ones who said, actually, we're going to raise the stakes. We're going to make you essentially either hold up Roe or overthrow it. It was the pro-abortion side that in their arrogance thinking, surely we've got this, because they threw down the gauntlet at that level, gave the Supreme Court essentially no choice other than to say either we support Roe through all 9 months, which means we overturn numerous state laws, or we overturn Roe, which has always been considered bad constitutional law, even by people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Okay, friends? So don't come at me and tell me it was just conservatives and Amy Coney Barrett who hates women. It was not. Okay? RBG also said it was a bad idea. And so there's a case, they were all stunned. And we were stunned in the sense that as I read that decision, I thought, they did this to themselves. Like, what? They are the ones who forced the hand of the Supreme Court. So guys, that gives me hope, because what that tells me is, because I do not believe that they are going to leave Christians and faith-based organizations and nonprofits who are faith-based. I don't believe they're going to leave them alone. We'll get to why not. I believe there's going to be a case that they will push too far, and it will go to the Supreme Court, and they will be the ones to lay out the line of like, it's either this or this. And the Supreme Court's going to go, okay. Because actually looking at precedent, not for the last, 20 years, looking at precedent for the last 4,000 years, we're going to side with this. And it's going to stun them. So to your point, I do believe that there will be a reversal on this, because I also think, even though we are evil people, without a savior, we are bent towards sin. I think there is, it says in scripture that each of us, there's something that speaks to God in us, and we either crush it and silence it or respond to it. And all of creation and all, and when you look at the brokenness that is coming out of the sexual revolution, and I believe you're going to see a pendulum swing on what's happening with transgenderism and all this, you will see this pendulum swing back to say, this is not working for us. We have all the freedom in the world, and we are miserable. We are depressed. We are suicidal. We hate life. Surely there's a better way. And that is where the wild and beautiful people get to step in.
Oh, yeah.
See how I tied that in, friends? Okay, so that's conspiracy theory number one. That at some point, and we may have to wait 50 years, to the pro-life movement's credit, they fought and they fought and they did not give up. And honestly, I feel like since Obergefell, people who were fighting on the marriage issue sort of gave up. They just said like, it's not winnable. We're going to be the jerks of society, whatever. And they gave up. And maybe now is the time to find a way to winsomely, beautifully, but truthfully engage on this very important issue. Very important.
And I would say, if you're not ready to engage verbally, something Joe and I say a lot about demonstrating the beauty of motherhood is to show delight in your children when you're in public. I would say here the same goes for marriage. Maybe you're not ready to go out and crusade against a law that's threatening marriage in your community, but you can go on a date. You can, talk about how great your spouse is on social media. I mean, there's different ways that you can show people that being married is beautiful, that God's plan for marriage is beautiful, and that maybe what humans were doing for the last 4,000 years wasn't such a bad idea.
Well, I mean, part of how did we get here is because Christians, Catholics, people of faith did a terrible job of keeping our marital commitments. And so we got to this point where, society said, if marriage is such a big deal, you all would stick to it, and you don't. So let other people have a crack at it. And we didn't really have an answer because, one, we couldn't define marriage, and two, we weren't investing in our own marriages. We weren't being honest where we were struggling and getting help. Part of that is no-fault divorce. But Jim Daly said it in a statement about this Disrespect for Marriage Act that passed. He said, we grieve the demise of a cultural consensus on the sacredness and exclusivity of one man, one woman marriage. But as Christians, we bear some responsibility for this shift and collapse.
That's
when believers fail to keep their own marital commitments, they undermine and weaken that which they claim to revere. And this part, hypocrisy is an awful witness. I was like,
that's powerful. Yes. I appreciate that though, because I hate walking away from these conversations where we criticize things feeling like there's no solution.
Yeah.
And personal responsibility is the greatest solution you can hand somebody. We don't need to go on a crusade against anybody. We need to transform our own lives and improve what we're doing to witness to marriage in our own lives. And that would change the world. It would have prevented Obergefell in the first place if we had done it better previously. And we know that that anything can be judged by the fruits that it produces. Marriage has produced a lot of wonderful fruits, not to mention every single human that's ever been created, whether they were in marriage or not. One man and one woman created that human.
Always and forever.
Yeah. And of course, no-fault divorce, many things diluted and denigrated marriage over the years. But if we look at the Obergefell decision, only really bad fruits have come from it. And it hasn't it hasn't strengthened the bonds of any relationship that I can tell. I can't say that I can look at Obergefell and say, well, yeah, maybe it was a bad decision, but it had this good effect over here, or it strengthened marriages here, or people are healthier and happier in this arena. Like, I just don't think that a decision as monumental as redefining marriage can really be credited with good fruits. And I think that speaks to another reason why we should teach our children what things are and not just set them up to have no response, no witness. Was it you're the Bible scholar, St. Peter, who said that we need to have a witness for everything that we're asked about our faith?
Oh, to have an answer, to give an answer for the hope that you have.
Thank you. Say the verse correctly.
It feels like Paul.
It feels like Paul, but I think it might have been Peter. I don't know. Who knows? You're probably right.
Well, and it, it's, again, this kind of goes back to the question of like, why now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If everything was going fine, why now? And there were 3 senators that did try to get better amendments into the bill to more explicitly protect harassment and persecution. Because when you point out, like, I don't see things being better. No, what I see cake bakers being taken to the Supreme Court.
Which happened, if you're not aware, Masterpiece Cake. Yep.
Masterpiece Cakes. Florist in Washington State taken to the Supreme Court. Here's my second conspiracy theory. / maybe it's prophetic. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Just, stay with me. So at the beginning of last week, I think it was, this thing passes. Like 2 days later, the Supreme Court is hearing a case, 303 creation versus the state of Colorado, essentially. And the state of Colorado was saying
horrible laws in this regard, by the way.
Well, they're where the cake maker is, so you'll see a trend. They were suing this woman who creates websites. And she had said, I don't want to create websites for same-sex marriages. I don't believe in that. As a person of faith, like, that just goes against my values.
Mm-hmm.
And so the state of Colorado was saying, nope, like, you don't get to say that. That's hate speech, all this stuff.
Which is so bizarre that in Colorado, you can literally go to an artist and be like, I command you to make this thing. And they don't, in Colorado law, they have to do it.
I'm like, there's nobody else? Like, there's no other cake maker. There's no other website designer. It starts to feel like you're intentionally targeting people that you know are going to disagree with you so that you can prosecute them, silence them, which is the very thing that people are saying, we're concerned. And then we're being told, no, it's going to be fine. You're like, no, but it's not fine because there's a case at the Supreme Court right now.
Right.
And so, you had these 3 senators and they pointed out, like, can you point to a single instance where a same-sex marriage law or a same-sex marriage couple is facing prosecution? And yet there is instance after instance after instance of people who define marriage as one man, one woman who are coming under attack. And here's my conspiracy theory. Okay, friends, don't you find it interesting? You have this act passed that basically redefines, wipes out, removes protections. But then you have before the Supreme Court an opportunity for them to make a ruling, and it won't come out until May or June of next year, that could strengthen religious liberties, that could strengthen our right to free speech and the First Amendment. Kind of like the Book of Esther, okay? So this law passes, and Haman is awful, and he gets the king, who's an idiot, to sign a law saying you can eradicate the Jews. And then Haman gets removed. But the law can't be overturned. It's Persian law. Little flaw in the system. Mordecai comes in. They're like, well, we can't overturn the law. So he gets the king to pass a new law that says, okay, this is still going to happen, but the Jews now get to protect themselves. That turned the tables. Suddenly, the Jews could defend themselves, and that really changed who decided to attack them. And so I just have to wonder if God's timing and providence and mercy is that even as we see this attempt to silence, you have another opportunity that in the midst of that may say, okay, but then how do we basically correct this in real time before a case comes to the Supreme Court specifically challenging, the Marriage Act? How can we already begin to give protections to people? Because we know that the Supreme Court majority right now is inclined towards reading the Constitution the way it should be. So again, I'm encouraged by that because I'm like, oh, isn't this fun to see like maybe how God is moving just so much bigger than we can imagine. And we get to live it real time.
It's amazing. And something I love about the 303 case. So we've talked about Christians playing very poor defense. Just guys, offense, defense is basically the only sports analogy that I know, so I overuse it. But
it's not even tied to a particular sport. That's fine. Great.
Yes, that's why I said sports analogy. I didn't say like football analogy. We play really bad defense. But terrible. And you saw in the Masterpiece shop, that was a Jack Phillips, this baker, a gay couple came to him and told him that they wanted to hire him to bake a cake to celebrate their same-sex union, their quote-unquote marriage. And he said, well, I'm a Christian. And I think he even offered to give them a white cake that was plain for them to have it decorated elsewhere. Or he offered to accommodate them in some way other than making them a wedding cake. But it became very clear that Jack Phillips had been targeted, like you said, targeted by this couple who probably was backed, not just, I don't want to put all the onus on this couple. They were probably backed by like a big organization that was trying to get a case to the Supreme Court. Anyway, long story short, Jack's case had to go all the way to the Supreme Court in Masterpiece Cake Shop. And Colorado law, even despite the outcome of that case, like is still horrible in this regard. But what I love about this 303 case that kind of is in the same vein is that she's sort of playing really good defense here because she's actually playing offense. This is like a preemptive case. There's some legal term for what this is called, but she hasn't actually been sued by a client yet. She just recognizes that in order to continue operating in her state as a Christian individual who's running a creative business, she's going to need greater protections for her constitutional religious freedom. And so this case,
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Did I correct something that you said?
Yeah, I think I said she'd been sued. So that's good.
Oh, no, I think she hasn't. If I remember the one like podcast I listened to about this.
It's giving us potentially this, and this is what's silly. It's giving us what should always be recognized. The right to free speech. I mean, it ties in with Twitter, all the Twitter files being released and the journalists losing their mind that journalism is happening. Like, what? You are reporting? I cannot. Yes. And again, when you look at the bigger context, how interesting that this all happened in 1 week, right? Like we're having a battle and these are specific issues. But if you pull back, and this is why it's important to read, this is why it's important to have an understanding of history and events, because you see like what's actually the deeper problem here. First Amendment, the right to free speech, religious liberty. What does that mean actually? And that those threads are running throughout a lot of what we're seeing hit the headlines right now. So yeah, that's our Christmas episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just kidding.
No,
we have a fun one for you next week.
Yeah.
Guys, we have a fun one. Yes. So next week, we're going to read the Christmas story too, but it's not us. It's some really cute little guests who are related to us.
Yes. Some little, very cute
That voices. Is definitely a kid-friendly episode.
We were practicing today, getting through the big words. Zechariah, census.
Good job. I should probably do that.
Quiridian. I can't even remember that guy's name. Whoever was like calling the census at the time.
I'm really glad I gave your children the big names. Good. So friends, we share this because again, we actually want to encourage you. If you're married, work on your marriage. Pursue a healthy marriage. It will transform the way your own children then live out marriage. It will show people in your community what marriage could and should look like. That alone is radical. Also, if you're single, pursue marriage the way Scripture lays it out. It's the best way for you. It leads to your flourishing. I promise 1,000,000,000%. And if you don't know what that looks like, we have an episode where we talked about sex as one starting point. And then also continue to read, continue to get educated. Don't be intimidated by topics that you're like, I don't know anything about this. Guess what? Everybody at some point didn't know anything about something and they then start. So just if there's something in this episode that was interesting to you, go after that. Learn a little bit more. And it will, I guarantee, come out in your conversations, come out in your faith, and just come out in the way that you are engaging with culture. So stay wild and beautiful until next week when you get to hear our kids.